What's up, guys? Welcome back for another one. Today we're going to be talking about the brain. Um, I will probably break this into two lectures. We'll do the first half and we'll do the second half. Um, let's get into it. So, obviously, the brain is part of the central nervous system. We will discuss all the various regions of the brain. Um, we will discuss the function of most of these regions of the brain. We'll talk about things like flow of CSF and cranial nerves and how the brain controls vital functions as well as sensory and motor functions. Um, so you can see here we have a few generalized regions of the brain. Obviously, we'll be discussing this in lab as well. First part I want to highlight is called the cerebrum. This whole top half is referred to as the forebrain. I guess it's more than half. And you can see there's many different folds, and we'll talk about what those are. You can see there's kind of this highlighted red area. So we have some subcortical structures, the cortex referring to the outside. This region's called the diencephalon, where we will talk about the thalamus. The hypothalamus we will talk a lot about in the endocrine system, as well as the pineal gland. So I'm going to reserve most of that conversation. I'll tell you generally what they do, but most of that conversation for the endocrine system. We have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum. The cerebellum is kind of the towards the posterior inferior aspect. Um, it is very important for fine-tuning movement, control, balance of your muscles, muscle memory, things like that. And we'll discuss some specific areas that are located there, as well as the brainstem. The brainstem contains the medulla and the pons, vital functions, breathing, heart rate regulation. We'll talk a lot about how the medulla can increase and decrease heart rate in response to certain stimuli. Um, but we're going to start off kind of at the top towards the outside. Um, in lab, obviously, you learn all the specific anatomy of all these different parts and stuff. But for here, we're going to not only introduce the parts, we're going to talk a little bit more about what they do and how they work. So the cerebrum, as you can see highlighted here by the blue and purple structures, has a lot going on. Um, in general, you can see it here, ability to read, write, speak, remember things, plan, move, um, consciousness in general, as well as interpreting sensory inputs are all regulated by various aspects of the cerebrum. And it has a couple different parts, right? So the first part you'll see here is the breakdown of the gray versus white matter, right? Let me see if I can pull that up. If we remember from the spinal cord, that gray matter kind of made that butterfly shape towards the middle, and then the white matter was towards the outside. In the brain, we have the gray matter towards the outside. We call this the cortex. So the cerebral cortex is the outermost region, composed primarily of gray matter. And we know from previous lectures that that gray matter is mainly made of cell bodies. And the white matter that we could see subcortical is primarily made of axons. And there's specific groups of axons we'll talk about in the next slide. And we'll talk about what they do in general. But here we could see gyri, sulcus, and then in the next couple slides, we'll talk about fissures. So what these are is a way to stash a lot of brain material in a small space, right? So you could see that this cortex has a folded-like structure, and these individual folds are called gyri, right? And we'll talk about two specific ones that are important. And then you have kind of these gaps, if you will, in between the folds, and these are called sulcus or sulci, and those are kind of the spaces. So between those two structures, it allows you to fold up this brain and have a lot of surface area in a smaller space. as discussed with the white matter, we have groups of axons that serve specific purposes. So we can see them highlighted here, as well as the next slide I'll go through. We'll highlight it a little bit more. But the three general tracts or groups of axons, if you will, are called association tracts, commissural tracts, and projection. So we'll talk about what these three tracts in general, we'll talk about what they connect, right? Do they connect areas on the same side of the brain? Do they connect opposite sides of the brain? Or do they connect brain to lower level structures like the spinal cord? And that's really the difference between these groups of axons. And we can see them here. So looking at a lateral view, we could see that there are, I'll do it in the same color actually, why not? There are axons called association tracts, right? Or association fibers that connect areas on the same side. So they will associate this area with this area, this area with this area, as opposed to commissural tracts, and this is looking at an anterior view, that will connect opposite hemispheres. So if we need messages to go from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, those messages or action potentials would be transmitted via commissural tracts, as opposed to the third type, which we could see here is going from the cortex downwards to the spinal cord. And we'll talk about some of these specifically and what they do as far as decusate and where they do this and a whole bunch of stuff. So in general, these are white matter. They're made of axons, but they're specific groups that are connecting different areas of the brain. Association connects same side, different lobes. Commissural connect right to left hemisphere, and projection connect brain to spinal cord. Pretty straightforward. And we can see that here on an actual picture with all the gray matter removed, association, projection, and commissural fibers, and kind of their orientation about where they're running. The third structure, we have gyri, sulcus, and the third one is a fissure, right? So here, fissures are large openings that basically are clearly visible and separate usually big regions of the brain. So we have a longitudinal fissure that separates the right from left hemisphere. And that longitudinal fissure, as it's separating down, is stopped because we don't want two completely different brains, right? We want two hemispheres, but we don't want them completely separated. And it's stopped, if you will, by the structure called the corpus callosum, right? So you'll see this in lab. We'll take a look at it today. And this corpus callosum is composed of some of these fibers we just discussed that connect your right to left hemisphere, aka commissural fibers. We have not only the longitudinal fissure, which we discussed, and now we can see from a superior view. We have a transverse or transverse cerebral fissure, which separates the cerebrum from the subcortical structure, the cerebellum, right? So they're just big gaps, basically, that separate large brain regions, and they're called fissures. When we dive into the cortex or the cerebrum in more detail, we see that there are multiple lobes, right? Clearly, most people are familiar with this, but it's all good. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe, right? The brainstem and cerebrum are not part of that forebrain. Each of these lobes serves specific purpose. So the brain in general, just like the spinal cord, is just a bunch of neurons, billions of them crammed into one spot. All they're doing is sending messages to one another to try to serve some specific purpose. What purpose is that? You can see it all highlighted here, and this is a very important slide, if you will. So the frontal lobe, and just there's other things that are important besides what's underlined. For example, you could see here motor planning. That's important, right? The frontal lobe in general, when I think about it simply, I think about motor function, right? as well as behavior, concentration, emotion, things like that. Problem solving, are all attributed to that frontal lobe and those neurons located there. When we look at the parietal lobe, we think of sensory input, right? Sense of touch, taste, things like that, visual perception. Um, when we think of the occipital lobe, I want to think about vision, right? Primary visual cortex, we'll talk about in a minute. Visual interpretation, more vision. When we talk about the temporal lobe, there are some specific structures we'll go into, but understanding language, memory, hearing, things like that are all associated with the temporal lobe. Just because it's here, might as well highlight it. Cerebellum, coordination, voluntary movement, balance, equilibrium, right? Brainstem, vital functions, right? ANS, talked about that last lecture. Autonomic nervous system, important vital functions like regulating heart rate, breathing, control of heart, some digestive aspects, swallowing, um, you know, pretty important stuff. So continuing to look at the cortex, you have even within those lobes, right? Certain areas are broken into a more specific function. So we talked about the parietal lobe, as in general, kind of the main sensory area. And we can see here that there is a primary somatosensory cortex. This is the main area where information will be sent to interpret various stimuli. But there's also association areas. So what's in communication with the primary will always be a kind of association area, if you will, right? So these primary areas are receiving the inputs, maybe about temperature. The association areas, we can think of secondary areas that are more processing and evaluating said stimuli. Example, right? The primary area says you can feel it. The processing area and these association fibers that we discussed previously are sending messages here, and it could tell you what it is, right? Feeling something and knowing what it is are two different things, and that's why you have two different areas. Same thing with the vision. You have a primary visual cortex that will allow you to see, but you have a visual association area that will let you diagnose what you are seeing, right? Same thing with the auditory area. You also have an auditory association area. So your primary areas kind of receive the inputs, and then the association areas connected via association fibers or association tracks help you deduce what that is, right? So that is the difference between primary and association cortex. It talks about damaged visual cortex here. Check it out. It's good. Summarize it for you. There are other talking about specific areas of the cerebrum or cerebral cortex. We know that whole cortex is made up of the gray matter, and we talked about the white matter underneath it. But there's two areas called the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. So we could see this highlighted here and here. The Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe. The Wernicke's area is located in temporal lobe. And we can see specific problems in the next slide. I'll highlight this. You have two videos you can check out. When this area is damaged, we have aphasia. So there's Broca's aphasia, right? Really, you have extreme difficulty talking. The speech would be very slowed, or maybe you wouldn't even be able to do it because that's the area responsible for speech, right? And then you have the Wernicke's area, where if there was aphasia in this region, they can speak, but the sentences, and you can see examples, make no sense. So the difference here is the ability to speak versus actually kind of coordinating that speech. maybe long, drawn-out sentences with words in random places, that is not really interpretable, right? So that's Broca's aphasia versus Wernicke's aphasia. And you can check both of these out here. And we previously discussed these gyri. Now we're going to highlight specific gyri, two of them that are very, very important to cortical function, right? There is a groove, if you will, that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, right? And there's a bump, and I'll try to draw it on here for you, in the front, and there's a bump in the back. And these are our two important gyri regions, right? Obviously, you have one on the right, one on the left, one on the right, one on the left. These are called the pre and post central gyri. And we can see them here, right? So that central sulcus separates the frontal from the parietal. So the precentral gyrus is located in the frontal lobe. It is responsible for voluntary movement. So if I want to contract a muscle, that message is coming from the precentral gyrus, sending messages down and out to that muscle. We'll talk about it, but I'll go into it now. Most of these messages are sent from the opposite side. We call that contralateral. So my left side, left precentral gyrus, controls the right side of the body and vice versa. Again, precentral gyrus, frontal lobe, primary motor cortex. These are where the action potentials that initiate voluntary movement are sent from. The postcentral gyrus, located in the parietal lobe, contains neurons that form the primary somatosensory area. And we discussed this on a previous slide. But all sensations for touch, pain, temperature, a lot of sensory messages that are going up to the brain will be received by this postcentral gyrus, and respectively, a lot of these are contralateral. So if I touch something that's warm with my right hand, that message is going to go up, and it's going to go to the left postcentral gyrus. Sensory inputs, parietal lobe, postcentral gyrus. Contralateral. So when we look at the precentral gyrus, and it's not just a piece right here, obviously it goes around that cortex, which is what you're looking at in this picture here. You'll take note that there's certain areas of this precentral gyrus that are responsible for various body parts. You do not have to memorize this picture and what areas control what digit and stuff like that, but it's an important concept, right? That there's neurons in this cortical area, cell bodies, that will send a message down and out through the spinal cord to their various regions, whether you want to contract a muscle in your hip, leg, hand, etc. You will see in lab, but you probably won't see it yet, that there are two general neurons that are involved in sending these motor messages down from the primary motor cortex. There is an upper motor neuron, which goes, and I'm trying not to write all the way up there because I'm going to shut it down, comes down. Basically, the upper motor neuron goes from your precentral gyrus down, oftentimes crosses in the medulla, goes down the spinal cord, and then you have your lower motor neuron. And we mentioned this in the spinal cord. The lower motor neurons, those cell bodies, are found in the anterior horn. And then that message comes out the spinal cord through a nerve to your muscle. So really, the pathway for voluntary motor control is quite simple, right? You initiate it, message goes down from an upper motor neuron, out through a lower to your muscle, muscle contracts. Pretty straightforward, right? Obviously, this guy doing some leg extensions. And that message, obviously, if you have both legs involved, is coming from both precentral gyruses. If you had one leg involved, it would be coming from the opposite, right? So right leg extension, left precentral gyrus. Similar type of structure for the postcentral gyrus, right? That primary somatosensory area. You can see that there's certain neurons that are dedicated to sensory input of certain areas in the body. And we will see that I didn't discuss it yet, but there's more space dedicated to particular areas of the pre or post central gyrus. So what we have is we have, look, here, hands, lips, right? Is we have what we call a homunculus. So we'll take a look at this in the next slide as well, but they kind of come up with these images to show how many neurons are in particular areas. So clearly here you see that the lips are enlarged and the hands are enlarged. And obviously, based off that picture I just showed you, you have more neurons controlling these areas. It allows for fine-tuned control, finger dexterity, lips, obviously, for their motor function and speech, etc. So you have the motor model as far as which things or what areas have more motor control. And you have the sensory model as far as what areas of the body receive the most sensory inputs or have the most sensory neurons contributing to that area. Right? And this summarizes both of them, right? Cool. We talked about that. Right? Same thing. Motor versus sensory. We see that there are different amounts of neurons dedicated to those particular areas for their respective function. Now we're going to get into, so that was the cortex, right? You got the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, primary visual cortex, couple association areas, gyri, sulcus, fissures, the whole nine. Pre and post central gyrus and what their major roles are. Now, that was the outside. So what we're going to dive into a little bit are what we call subcortical structures or structures that are underneath the cortex, right? We'll highlight a few of them. The thalamus, the hippocampus, obviously medulla pons we'll get to, and what they do. So this is cool. You can click on this link here, and you could literally go through and look at all these structures. I'm going to highlight some of the major ones here, but it's not a bad thing to kind of go through and practice. Obviously, you need an internet connection. Pretty helpful, and it could even tell you like what they do and stuff. But we talked about the cerebrum. We talked about the cerebellum. We mentioned the medulla and the pons, right? So what I'm going to introduce real quick are some of these substructures found in some of them found in the diencephalon. And the first one's the thalamus, right? So here, this thalamus is located right there. And in general, one of the major functions is its role in relaying sensory messages as they come up through the spinal cord to various areas of the brain for sensory input, right? So we say that it filters sensory messages, it relays sensory messages. I think on the next slide or two slides, we'll go into a little bit more detail in that. But think about the thalamus as far as sensory input regulation. The hypothalamus, oh boy, will we talk about the hypothalamus, but we'll talk about it more when we get into the endocrine system. So you've mentioned the hypothalamus with the ANS, right? The autonomic nervous system. And kind of its role in involuntary automatic responses to stimuli, heart rate, other functions from hunger to sex to stress, etc. So what this hypothalamus is, and we could see it, if I highlight it right here, you could see it over here, is kind of a neuroendocrine bridge, It does receive plenty of neural stimulus. It is very important in a lot of the nervous system, but it is also capable of producing hormones. And these hormones are very powerful hormones that regulate the release of other hormones. So when we get into the endocrine system down the road, we will talk about the hypothalamic role a lot more. We also have the pineal gland, which is part of the epithalamus. The pineal gland, which you can see is located right back here. I'm actually looking. They don't. Oh, they do have it. The pineal gland is involved in your circadian rhythm, your patterned sleep cycle, melatonin production, and kind of the autorhythmicity of your waking and going to bed cycles. That's the pineal gland. And lastly, on here, I shall highlight the pituitary gland. Kind of similar to that hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is really important in hormone production and regulation. The pituitary gland is, notice its close proximity to the hypothalamus. It is under very important regulation of that hypothalamus as well. So when we think about hypothalamus and pituitary gland, we're thinking as we progress through lots of endocrine or hormone-based functions. We mentioned the thalamus. We got a slide that talks about it. As stated, well, one, I give you all the functions here, right? Relay station for sensory input, et cetera, et cetera. Some motor messages do pass through there, and we'll discuss that when we get into some diseases and things. But a lot of these messages are coming up from the spinal cord. These would be sensory messages, right? Sensory messages go up. They're ascending. They're afferent. They're going to the central nervous system. So that thalamus we can kind of think of. I like this picture because that this is what we call a second order and a third order sensory neuron. So your first order sensory comes in, synapses with the second order goes up, synapses second and third in that thalamus, and then that third order sensory neuron gets relayed to most likely postcentral gyrus or something. So whereas the motor pathway, you had two, an upper and a lower. In sensory pathways, we have three, right? So that second order would be down here somewhere. And our first order would be located usually in the receptors or whatever. So that thalamus, that's what I say, it plays a very important role in the relay station and kind of filtering a lot of these sensory inputs. There is a group of structures we refer to as the emotional brain, aka the limbic system. We can see some of these structures highlighted here. There is a video about the hippocampus and memory, right? It's interesting. Check it out. It's not that long, but it really shows you kind of the role of some of these subcortical structures as far as like daily function goes that we kind of don't think about. We just do it. So it's a good one. So check that out. And we'll talk more about this. This is just a type of issue that one might have with blood flow through the brain, right? This is called a TIA, transient ischemic attack. So this can happen in any of those areas that we were discussing, right? What would symptoms be of this? It depends what area that we were discussing would be affected, right? It could result in paralysis, numbness, weakness. You could have slurred speech or difficulty understanding speech, depending on the Broca's or the Wernicke's area. You can have vision issues if it's the primary visual cortex. So what a TIA is usually associated with impaired blood flow. right? So any one of those structures we just talked about could have an issue. All of it needs blood flow, right? So if you have lack of blood flow to a particular area, obviously depending on the size of the blood vessel or where it's running to, and we'll see that could have different problems. Um, but they're like mini strokes, right? They usually don't persist for very long, and usually they don't leave any permanent damage, right? But we see this if you've had one, there's probably a reason why you have the mini stroke. So oftentimes we see a CVA is a cerebral vascular accident, more commonly known as a stroke. So in a decent percentage of these individuals that suffer from TIAs, we see that they eventually have a more serious stroke-like episode, right? So a TIA is kind of like a mini stroke, if you will. Um, so the brain uses a lot of oxygen, right? And when you get into the more serious cerebral vascular accident, aka the stroke, um, this is where you start having death of brain tissue, right? So brain cells need a lot of oxygen. They need a lot of sugar, right? So if the area goes without nutrients for a couple minutes, you can have massive amounts of cells dying. You have a lot, you still need these cells. Most of the time when we see this damage occur, whether it be in the left precentral gyrus that results in paralysis or something of the right side of the face, most of the time we see that this damage cannot be reversed. Once you lose 2 million neurons, um, you know, you're in trouble. Um, so the stroke is death of brain tissue caused by lack of oxygen. Two major reasons that you may have reduced blood flow to a particular area are plaque buildup, right? We call this atherosclerotic plaques, or atherosclerosis. And that's one of the major reasons you see strokes and things of that nature. And then we also have hemorrhagic strokes. So different types of, hypertension and various types of medications can result in what we call an aneurysm, right? Or the ballooning of an artery. The arterial wall gets weak and it kind of stretches out, and eventually that can rupture. So not only can you have what we call blockage, right? In the case of the plaque buildup, blood vessels blocked, nothing could get through, right? No blood's getting through there. Um, or rupturing of that blood vessel that causes leaking, right? Obviously, if blood's leaking out to where it's not supposed to go, one, you have serious intracranial pressure problems. And two, blood might not be getting to the area that is required, right? Less common, but both do occur. As far as recognizing a stroke, right? Fast, right? Face, arm, speech time. Oftentimes you'll have speech issues, paralysis, um, you name it, right? Commonly we'll see like the lips droop and stuff like that from lack of motor function to one side of the precentral gyrus. And we know how quickly those brain cells die. So very, very, very important. Um, again, depending on the size and location of the blood vessel, you may have different amounts of damage done, right? Big picture, lack of blood flow to the brain results in tissue death. We discussed many different roles of various parts of the brain. So if those areas aren't getting blood flow, then that's where you have your problem. So you can see here, a little blood vessel was blocked. Maybe that's postcentral gyrus. Maybe you have some sensory input, numbness, whatever, as opposed to a bigger blood vessel blocked would result in a larger area of the brain that's not receiving blood and more complications, right? Cool. Makes sense. Another type of test or imaging for these more cortical areas that we're discussing is called an EEG, right? An electroencephalogram. And basically, like I said, you got bajillions of messages being sent all over the place. And there's ways that they can kind of pattern these and see certain trends, right? So they put these electrodes on, And the result would be various types of brain waves, right? You could read this. And the waves are grouped into four general categories. We have alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, and delta waves, right? And in general, you don't have to know about the cycles and the hertz and the frequency. But in general, alpha waves are present in nearly all individuals when they are awake. But they disappear. So you could say like awake, but not really super active. But they disappear during sleep, right? I'm gonna highlight that in red. Beta waves, you can think of as present during lots of activity, right? Lots of motor input, lots of sensory input, lots of stuff is going on in the brain, very, very active. Those would be our beta waves, and we'll see what they look like in 2 seconds. Theta waves usually present in children and adults experiencing stress. And delta waves occur during sleep or in infants. So what these look like, as well as a nice summary for all of this, right? It's just your alpha waves aren't first, beta waves, whatever, switch them. Just make sure you're reading the correct one. We can see the busy, active mind beta waves, a lot of scribble scrabbles all over the place. Alpha waves, right, when they're awake, kind of a moderate wave. Theta waves, a little bit scrambled during that emotional stress and drowsiness, and the beta waves clearly are very, very chill. If they are present during awakeness, you have a problem. And these are EEG waves. You should know which ones are associated with what type of cerebral state. And now we're going to dive into the cerebellum, right? And I'll probably walk through this and take a little break, right? Reset, and we'll have another video for the rest of this because it can be a little bit dense. So clearly, cerebellum, come on, located here, posterior, inferior to that occipital lobe. Very, very important. It connects to different areas of the brain that are involved, whether it be the cerebral cortex and that precentral gyrus, a basal ganglia that we will discuss in a little bit, or the thalamus that has some motor role. It's connected and it's primarily involved in motor movement, but more importantly, fine-tuning that movement and balance associated with those more complex motor activities. There are a couple different regions, and this is more anatomy. You don't necessarily need to stress a lot about this, but we kind of have subconscious aspect of skeletal muscle movement and equilibrium, and there's different areas of this that are responsible for different stuff, right? Clearly, things that it would be regulating, right? Specific sports movements requiring a lot of hand-eye coordination. It's a complex feat, right? Things like eating, right? Drawing, posture, basic movements patterns like walking, at every type of exercise, you name it. The cerebellum is going to play an important role in regulating that motor function. So we have something that we call ataxia, right? When you have damage to or an issue with the cerebellum, right, it results in the inability to coordinate muscular movements. This can happen from various diseases, right? From MS to Parkinson's. This can happen under the influence of alcohol. It can happen from damage to it, from lack of blood flow, etc. But this shows the ataxia, cerebellar ataxia, shows the significance um, of how important that cerebellar control is for your daily functioning activities, right? So you could read through this, check that out. And we dive in. So we talked about the cortical structures, We talked about some subcortical structures. We briefly mentioned the cerebellum, right? We'll go into more. And we also have the brainstem. So I will introduce this. Um, and then I'll take a short break. Then we'll come back with the next video and I'll wrap it up. So the brainstem is controlled primarily, and this is where we get into some detail. The medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, right? These are kind of separated from the forebrain and those subcortical structures, and they're right in between kind of the brain and the spinal cord, if you will. Obviously, the spinal cord would be coming out the bottom. And this is what we're going to dive into, right? So I will stop this. So let me double check this real quick. See how many we got left. Yeah. I will stop this and then we will pick up with finishing up with all the brainstem, as well as a bunch of other stuff.